In this video, we're talking about steaming milk. Welcome, my name is Patrik and this is Coffee with April. For this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about milk steaming, not in a latte art kind of sense, but more in a texture, taste, and what you kind of think about in terms of basics, right? There's a lot of conversations when it comes to steaming milk that are obviously very based in on the visual aspect of it, right? But especially when you start competing doing milk beverages, you realize that there's a lot more to it. So texture, taste, how well are you mixing that milk with the espresso? How are you doing it? Is all very important when it comes down to enjoying that, right? A good example is, for example, that usually there is a big difference between the first and the second sip in terms of texture, right? And the question here, how are you kind of fixing that? Or how can you make a milk steamed better so that your milk beverage in the end tastes a lot better, right? So we're gonna go through a few of those pointers now in this video, right? So step one is always gonna be, what milk are you using? Obviously the milk is gonna have a massive impact. And that it goes, when you use normal milk, are you using high fat milk, low fat milk? What's the protein? What are the cows eating? There's a lot of different factors there that are gonna be really important. Temperature of milk when you're steaming it is also going to be really important, right? Then you have special features like, for example, freeze distilled milk, which is quite common now in competitions. How do you deal with that, and do you have to deal with that a little bit different, right? So we're trying to kind of cover all the basics here. Here at April in the store, we use an unhomogenized milk that comes from a small regenerative farm outside of Copenhagen called Søtofte. It's a great milk, but it is very, very inconsistent. So it's a great example of what happens when you're kind of trying to have a little bit more of a natural product that makes it a lot more difficult. One, because the fat content is going up and down. And it's hard to say that the higher the fat content, the more difficult, or the lower the fat content, the more difficult. I would definitely say that you have to always be above 2%. But from there, or in between there, there's a range where you can do a lot of different stuff, right? But it's definitely something to consider, especially if that fat content is going to be fluctuant the way that it is in the milk that we're using, right? So keep that in mind. Basic stuff, as in when we're using the pitcher, we fill it up until the beginning of the nozzle, right? So it's pretty simple. That's how basically all the milk pitchers on the market is designed, right? So you don't want to underpour, you don't want to overpour. We're not underpouring because then it goes too fast and you can't stretch the milk and get the right temperature. We don't want to overpour because then when you stretch the milk, you're not going to have enough room for the milk to stretch in the actual pitcher, right? So that's just the basics. You need to be able to figure those out. Now, naturally, it goes without saying, steam wines are very, very different, right? So really try to figure out which steam wine is the one that works out for you. Obviously, a lot of people don't get to choose. That's one of the challenging things when we're competing as well. We just have to adapt to whatever steam wine that is in a competition. Similar to the brewing machine, for example, at home, right? And usually when it comes to espresso machines, what makes it more expensive is how good does that machine actually steam milk. That's pretty much what it comes down to. The basic part of brewing espresso is usually very similar from machine to machine in home use and to some degree also in professional use, right? But one of the things we can say, like one, start by flushing, really important, right? Two, placement is everything. So you want to make sure that you're placing the steam wand in the milk in a way that allows you to stretch the milk as good as possible and then take away all of those micro bubbles, right? So as few bubbles as possible. And it's not just a visual thing. It's also just about how do you make the milk as dense as possible, right? Because steaming milk without any kind of visual bubbles is quite easy, especially if you steam really, really thin milk. But if you're steaming really thin milk, it often doesn't taste very good. So the challenge when it comes to steaming milk is how do you steam a milk with a richer kind of texture, but without those micro bubbles, because you want that density. If you steam a milk foam a little bit more textured and still have a lot of those micro bubbles, even though they're not really visual for the eye, it's not going to come out tasting very good. So it's all about that density of the milk, right? And you get that by actually placing the steam wand a lot closer to the center than what a lot of people do. What you want to do is you want to stay away from placing that steam wand close to the edge of the pitcher. And the reason for that is because the pitcher, one, is going to heat up really quickly because you're actually heating up the material directly. So by placing it more center in the milk, it's going to allow you to have a little bit more time and actually make sure the milk is more evenly temperatured. Secondly, what you want to think about is that you want to think about the rotation of the milk, and you want to try to create kind of a vortex looking movement where the milk is actually moving like this rather than like this. So a lot of people, when they learn how to steam milk, they start by just steaming the milk like this. The issue is that if you don't have a vortex that goes down to the bottom, you're not going to evenly distribute that milk. So what happens when you're done steaming is that you come out with a milk that is thick in the top and quite thin in the bottom. Which, to be fair, from a visual perspective, you can basically fix just by having a few different pitchers and just split the milk, right? The issue there, though, is that you're still going to have a taste difference between the thinner part in the bottom and the thicker part on top, even if you try to mix that relatively evenly. It's just different micro bubbles. So if you want to really break it down to texture, then that's really, really important. And one, that requires a little bit of practice. It took me a lot of practice. I'm still practicing. And two, it's also a little bit of letting go of some of those conventional ideas, right? Basically, the whole point of this video is just trying to explain that there's a difference between what visually looks like really tasty and two, actually tastes really good. Not saying that a tasty milk beverage should look bad. That's not the point here. But the secret in terms of if your milk steaming is really good, it's actually not a visual thing. Like, you can't see that 100% in terms of taste. You actually have to taste it, right? So it's when you taste a beverage once, twice, 3, 4 times, you want to be able to have that same kind of texture all the way through. And that's really, really difficult, right? So that's just one of the basics, right? Another basics that we talked about a lot in general within the competition circle is temperatures. The kind of working idea now is that the lower the temperature, the sweeter the milk, which, to be fair, is kind of true. It comes down to protein and fats and how they actually react. However, you want to be careful not to go too low there, because then it just doesn't taste very good and you still need time to stretch that milk. So there's just a natural limit to how low you can go in temperature, right? But all of those things are stuff that we kind of consider a lot here at April on a daily basis, and also naturally in a competition format, right? So in the end of the day, it's about how can we steam a milk that goes better with the espresso, because when you spend a lot of time training for a competition or just a lot of time drinking those milk beverages side by side in steaming, you're going to realize quite quickly that there is a difference in the taste quality, even though they visually look quite good, just because the amount of microbubbles are quite different, right? So even if you don't see it, one milk can be denser than the other, right, in the final pour. And it's not just about the amount of foam, it's about the quality of that foam that makes all the difference, right? So bottom line, milk steaming is complicated and probably deserves a lot more time and a lot more practice than what we in general in the coffee industry, at least as roasters, would dedicate to it. But this is kind of a first video to explore what that means. And then we're going to come up with more videos down the road that kind of breaks down a little bit more in detail. What can you do to actually make it better? Maybe do have better pitchers, better temperatures, so on, right? And also walk you through a little bit of these kind of freeze distilled, more fun competition format styles milk as well, to kind of discuss what the details there are, right? But as I said, this is just the first kind of introduction video. We want to thank you for watching. And as always, we're going to take this conversation over to Patreon. So make sure you sign up there and get the latest kind of updates as well. And with that, we want to say thank you for watching and have a good day. We want to give a special thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. It's because of you that we are able to continue to make these videos. And we want you all to feel free to always come with suggestions and ideas on the content that you want to see, because we are doing this for you and because of you. Thank you from all of us here at April.